My name is Maggie Kruesi of the American Folklife Center, and we're here on October 20th, 2006, and I'm interviewing Dr. Don Yoder. And I have some questions that were composed by Leonard Premiano. Dr. Yoder, when did you first become interested in the study of folk religion?
It's hard to say. I have always been interested in folk culture because I come from country people. Both my father and my mother were born on farms, and I have country cousins in central Pennsylvania who spoke English dialect and as well as Pennsylvania Dutch dialect, and I became interested in the difference between their life and my city life that I was growing up with. And but it took more time. I was always interested in the history of religion, and I got my doctor's degree at the University of Chicago in what used to be called American Church History. We don't use that term anymore. It's religion in America. And I became interested in, when I was teaching folk culture at the University of Pennsylvania, I began to read some anthropological writings, Redfield and so forth, who investigated what they called folk Catholicism in Central America, Mexico, and so forth. And I became aware from that route that there was a difference between people's beliefs in religion and the religion that is taught from the pulpit and the theological seminaries and so forth. And through my studies in Germany of German Volkskunde and my meeting with people over there, my colleagues at the various German universities, I became aware that they were working on this level of religion. I guess we could call it a level folk religion in the German-speaking countries. And in the early 1900s, about 1903, there was a Lutheran minister named Paul Drews, D-R-E-W-S, who became interested in the fact that you need to train young ministers who are in the theological seminaries and who are going out to country and urban class, working class parishes in the cities to be able to understand the religion, the people's understanding of religion. And this is folk religion. And very often ministers and the people in the pew certainly didn't look at Lutheranism in the same way in Germany. I went into all of the treatments of Volksreligion, or they really call it religiöse Volkskunde, the folk life of religion or religious folk life, which you use in the title of this paper, this commission of the American Folklore Society. So I became aware of this, and I began to use the term folk religion. I don't always use it today. I sometimes prefer folk spirituality and other terms, or people's religion, that sort of thing. But I taught a very pioneer course, I think, in America, on American folk religion in 1957. I don't think Leonard was around then, but it was, I think, one of the very first courses in looking at this level of religion in the American churches and denominations.
Right, and what was your inspiration for that class? Why did you think it was a good time to begin to be able to teach that?
My interest was growing, and I decided to offer a class. Mostly it was a mixed class of graduate and undergrad senior students and so forth. Mm-hmm. But I also went on in 1971, I think it was, the American Folklore Society met in Washington, and I gave a paper toward a definition of folk religion. I became interested in trying to define folk religion in different ways, and I went into the American anthropologists' definitions of folk Catholicism and the European scholars' attempts to see the difference in the levels of religion there, and I came up with some definitions. And this was published in Western Folklore in 1974, I guess.
Right.
Yes.
Very important article. And when did you get interested in trying to add the term folklife to the department name in Penn?
Well, that, of course, Folklife comes out of my work with Dr. Shoemaker, Alfred L. Shoemaker, and the Pennsylvania Folklife Society, which we founded. We began in 1949 at Franklin and Marshall College, a little college, an old college in eastern Pennsylvania that I had studied at, and I went back there in 1949 as a professor. And there were 3 professors who were interested very much in the Pennsylvania German culture and in analyzing it, studying it, and helping it to move into the future, linguistically and every other way. And this was Dr. Alfred L. Shoemaker, who began what actually was the first American program in folklore in a college in the United States, a course in a Department of American Folklore. It didn't last too long, but it did pioneer. And J. William Fry, who was the head of the German department, and both of them were native speakers of Pennsylvania Dutch, growing up in families that used it. And I was halfway there. My father spoke it perfectly and grew up with it, and I learned as much as I could from him. And so in 1949, these 3 professors began what was called the Pennsylvania Dutch Folklore Center. And it was an institute for research and analysis of one culture, which was based on the European ideas of the regional institutes that Dr. Shoemaker had visited and that I would visit after 1950 almost every year in Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Belgium, Holland, and the British Isles and Scandinavia. I made that a point of meeting colleagues in folk cultural studies wherever they were teaching. I familiarized myself with their institutes and their seminar libraries, which I used, and so forth. And I've kept up with most of these friendships. We've exchanged books and so forth. At the meeting at Trento in Italy last March, I met some of my old colleagues in Germany. Dr. Brückner, Wolfgang Brückner, who is one of the principal folk cultural scholars in Europe. He is retired from his post at the University of Würzburg, and many others that I had met on my academic travels. So the term folklife actually came to America through Dr. Shoemaker, who was in the intelligence service in the American Army during the Second World War, and after the war, he went to Sweden and Ireland, where they were both countries were looking at their own cultures, which is what folklife studies does. It's not the anthropological idea of going to a foreign country, a non-Western country, and living yourself into an understanding of the culture, but the scholars in folk culture in Europe, in folklife studies, look at their own culture, and they grow up in it, and they go away and study various methods of analysis, anthropological, historical, linguistic, and come back and study their own culture further. And I think that's what my understanding of folklife studies is. And after 1950, a year after the 3 of us, the triumvirate, founded this very important young institution to look at the Pennsylvania German culture, I began my travels in Europe, and I've been over there at least 50 times since 1950. One year in 1983, the 300th anniversary of the first German-speaking settlement in North America, Germantown, which was the first Pennsylvania German settlement also. I was there 3 times as a guest of the German government for a conference, the guest of the University of Cologne, and the American U.S. Information Agency. They flew me all over. The last one, I spoke at 9 universities, and 2 in one day in some cases. It was quite a trip. So I became interested in using the term folklife after my trips to Europe, when I familiarized myself with what was going on in the academic world in this area of folk cultural studies, which is again a synonym for folklife studies. And when I went to Penn in 1956, I was first in the religious thought department. We finally changed that to the religious studies department. I always objected to the idea that religion is only intellectual. It has much more many more dimensions than the intellectual. And I like R.R. Merritt's statement that primitive man did not believe his religion, he danced it. So we changed the title of the department to Religious Studies, and I continued in that, but my work, my field work was mostly in folklife studies in Pennsylvania and with the Pennsylvania German or Pennsylvania Dutch culture, and eventually I transferred to the new folklore program, which McEdward Leach, a very distinguished English scholar and folk song scholar, who founded the program in 1964. He died in 65 or 66, and I was chosen by Dean Roy Nichols of the Graduate School to be his successor. And it was then that I was able to effect the very important change of title of the program of the Department of Folklore and Folklife. And this was noticed in Europe. Dr. Wildhaber, Robert Wildhaber, the great Swiss folk cultural scholar who knew more about the Balkans and Ireland and so forth than many of the native scholars of those countries. I entertained him in America several times. He entertained me in Switzerland many times, and we discussed things. And he was the editor of the International Folklore Bibliography, as it was called in English until this happened. He liked the idea of adding the term "and folklife" from my work at Pennsylvania, and he changed the title of this international bibliography, the English title, to International Bibliography of Folklore and Folklife. That has recently been shifted back to folklore, I'm sad to say.
And also, you knew Richard Weiss?
Yeah, Richard Weiss was a very important influence on me. He was the leading Swiss folklife scholar, well, equal to Robert Wildhaber. Robert Wildhaber was head of the Museum of Swiss Folklife, which was part of the Ethnological Museum at Basel, and that recently has changed the title. They've changed it from the Swiss Folk Museum or Folklife Museum to the Museum of European Cultures. The same thing happened in Berlin to broaden the concept of collecting and display of cultures. They include all of the European cultures. Richard Weiss wrote a book which came out in 1946 called Volkskunde der Schweiz, the folk culture of Switzerland. And it's a huge book, almost 600 pages, and he goes into Switzerland's key position and transitional position between Northern Europe and Southern Europe, Germanic Europe and Mediterranean Europe, and between the East and the West. He has a magnificent essay on a cultural line that goes down through Switzerland along the River Reuss near Luzern, and east of that the culture was dominated from Vienna, and west of that it was dominated from Geneva and Paris. And he illustrates this in fascinating ways. He says that even the playing cards on the different sides of this line were made. One were the Austrian Viennese playing cards, and the other were the Parisian Geneva playing cards. So I made it a very great point to visit Richard Weiss. I wrote to him, and I went to Zurich, where he was professor of Volkskunde at the great University of Zurich, and he entertained me for a day at his house at Küsnacht on the Lake of Zurich, and we talked about how we both got interested in looking at our own cultures. And I said that it was through my rural background, which I will always stress and always be glad that I have, and it's very interesting to try to explain to students who grew up in cities what it means to live on your own farm and to plow it and go through the seasons with it and so forth. And I had to do that in my folklife classes, as you perhaps remember. Anyway, he said that he became interested in Swiss folk culture through his summers in Graubünden, the southeastern canton of Switzerland, where his grandfather lived. And he went to his grandfather's farm. So we had a very similar background in coming to our serious work on our own cultures. And I've always admired his work in attempting to analyze what elements folk life has. And from the Swiss background, he says, is it a unified subject, or is it made up of folk costume, folk foods, folk architecture, and folk medicine, and all the different genres, as we might say, as folklorists, that you study under folk life. And he did unify it under his definition of folk life studies is the culture that is based on community and tradition. You have to have a community to have folk life studies, folk life, and you have to have a living tradition that comes from the past to the present. And this, it seems to me, denies the possibility of small group folklore that some of our recent folklorists have talked about, collegiate folklore, where there's really no community. It's a temporary community created by students coming together in the same year, and that sort of thing. I still think that we have to go into the classic idea of community, where the individual was subsumed under the community, and the individual is moved by the traditions that has come through his family and through his church affiliations, through some of his schooling, that sort of thing. So I value Richard Weiss and Robert Wildhaber's ideas about looking at their own culture, and they have both influenced me terrifically. But there have been other European scholars who have influenced me also, like Karl Hermann Tilhagen, who was the head of the section on folk belief at Nordiska Museet, the Nordic or Scandinavian Museum at Stockholm, and a brilliant scholar. And he wrote one of the most important books on folk medicine that has ever come out, Folklig Läkekunst, in Swedish. And that has influenced me in my work on folk medicine. But others have influenced me too. And I must say that when Dr. Shoemaker and I and Dr. Fry founded the Pennsylvania Dutch Folklore Center, we were still folklorists in a sense, but we began to prefer the term folk life and folk life scholarship and so forth from our studies in Europe. And my first book was a folk song book, showing that I was influenced by the folklore tradition in the United States. It was a book it was the first book of Pennsylvania Dutch folk songs. It was called, I invented the title, I'm good at that, Songs Along the Macantongo. This is the area, the Macantongo Valley, where my father's people settled after the Revolution, and I'm related to half or three-fourths of the people who live there even today, and most of them still talk Dutch, the people at least over 50. And that was a book which I co-authored with two cousins of mine, Walter Boyer and Albert Buffington. Albert Buffington was a professor of German at Penn State University, and Walter Boyer was a country preacher and high school superintendent, who both of them had grown up in the area of Macantongo, and I had all these roots in Macantongo. So in the 1940s, we went around with a very heavy, almost impossible to lift disc maker, you know. It wasn't a tape recorder, or it wasn't a wire recorder, which I used later on, which I hated. And I was once, I went to a farmhouse and wanted to record some people that I had gotten to know, and I carried this heavy wire recorder in, and they thought perhaps I was a Jehovah's Witness minister with a canned sermon, you know, which I certainly was not. I would deny that the rest of my life. Anyway, we became folk life scholars, all of us, and from the beginning at Franklin and Marshall College, and we began the magazine, the Pennsylvania Dutchman in 1949, which began as a weekly, and people warned us. They said, "Oh, you'll run out in 3 months. You won't have enough material." And we would have had enough material from the manuscript and book material and recordings that we were doing to last for several hundred years as a weekly. But we finally became a monthly and then a quarterly Pennsylvania Folklife in 1958. And at that time, we changed the name of the Pennsylvania Dutch Folklore Center to the Pennsylvania Folklife Society. It really was an odd society. The only membership was that you subscribed to the magazine, but we used the term society, which was all right. And in 1950, the three of us, largely Dr. Shoemaker, but the three of us aided him, 2 of us aided him in founding the Pennsylvania Dutch Folk Festival at Kutztown, Pennsylvania, a typical Pennsylvania Dutch town, and that has been going since then. It's now fortunately under Kutztown University and managed very well at the present time. And by 1960, 10 years, the festival had begun to attract 100,000 people a year in a week who came to see we tried to put the Pennsylvania Dutch culture on display at a festival in ways that you cannot do in a museum. And we had living craftsmen. I hope they were living, and people could talk with them and ask them questions. And we had programs. I had the so-called seminar stage, the music term, but I had people. I had powwow doctors that I had on the stage, and they would demonstrate how they would powwow for wildfire and other ailments and so forth. And we had dialect programs, and we had a program where we invited the cooks from the church tents that served the Dutch meals to talk about their foods, and it was a very interesting occasion. We had a main stage with more traditional entertainment like folk dancing, and one evening I had to MC the folk dancing performance. It was rather agonizing for me, but I got through it. We had all sorts of groups, adult groups, and we had the little jiggers, they were called, little jiggers, in the Pennsylvania Dutch say jiggers. A little group of children that danced, and they gave them prizes. I had to award the prizes and so forth. It's a very important part of my background, my lurid career. But the festival I went, we made the mistake, I think, of going. No, it was good that we went in 1951. Dr. Shoemaker hired a bus and took some of the best performers of the Pennsylvania Dutch culture, singers, and Sivaiah Baylor, the powwower, and we went to St. Louis. They went to St. Louis, and Bill Fry and I had classes, so we had to go by Pullman on the train, which you could still do at that time, and we arrived there the next morning, and Dr. Shoemaker had taken the group to the mayor's office in St. Louis and got the golden key of the city and that sort of thing. And the reason why we went to St. Louis in 1951 was Sarah Gertrude Knott's National Folk Festival. And we put on legitimate folklife performances, but I was really shocked, and Dr. Shoemaker was shocked at the rest of the festival. It was mostly song and dance, as most folk festivals were, until our Pennsylvania Dutch Folk Festival attempted to put on a whole culture on display as much as we could in 1 week in ways that you can't do in a museum. But I was somewhat shocked at it was just a performance of the rest of the performers just sang songs and did dances on the stage. It was with a passive audience and so forth, and it was not like the Kutztown Festival. So that sharpened us up on improving the festival and making it more people-friendly.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Sivaiah Baylor, was her name?
Yes, Sivaiah Baylor was a very interesting old woman. She was in her 80s when she came to the festival, and she lived in a place called Tremont in the mountains, a coal town not too far from where my father's people had settled south of that. And she talked perfect Pennsylvania Dutch, but when she talked English, as I said last night, she was from the coal regions, and she spoke Irish English. She said, "Don't let me go," and so forth, things like that. And I would get her to perform on the stage how she would demonstrate, how she would treat erysipelas, not syphilis, but erysipelas, which the Pennsylvania Dutch call wildfire or wildfire. And it's a reddishness of the skin, which is hard to get rid of, and sometimes even medical doctors sometimes have trouble in curing it, and so people go to powwows for it, or went to powwows for it. And she would take a child from the audience, like that high, and she would take a red string from her apron pocket and make it taut and touch the top of the boy's head or the girl's head and bring it down over the body, touching the body all the way and sweeping the string to the right. And she did that 3 times, and she said in Pennsylvania Dutch, "Wildfire, flee, flee, flee. Der rode Vater jagt dich, he. And then im Namen des Vaters, des Sohnes und des Heiligen Geistes, Amen. But you have to name the name of the person too before you say Amen. And that is, in translation, wildfire, fly, fly, fly. The red string chases you away, away, away. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, help to this, the name of the person, Amen. So it's a pagan charm, as most of these powwow charms are, but it's Christianized by the Trinitarian formula, or the 3 highest names, as she called that, the Trinitarian formula. And the idea was that she did this 3 times, and the idea was that you collect the redness of the ailment in the string. And I asked her what you did with it. She said, first of all, no one dare stand beside me when I sweep the string there, or that person will catch the disease, the idea of transfer. And then I asked her what you do with the string, and she said, I smoke it. And she had to explain that, of course. She put it on her wash line, which hung above her wood stove in the kitchen. This was all done in her house at Tremont, and she would light it and loop it over the wash line and light it. It would smolder, and the ashes would fall to the iron top of the stove, the range, and she would lift a stove plate and sweep the ashes into the living fire to destroy it. So this illustrates several ideas of primitive medicine which were taken over in pagan times in Europe and survived down to the present time, even though the Middle Ages were Catholic, and for 400 or 500 years we've been Protestant. So this is very interesting, and she was very accommodating in doing this on the stage. And I have wonderful pictures of her, and I'm going to use them in my new book on powwowing, which I hope will be done next year.
You know, one of my great thrills was your wire recordings that you
Oh,
made
yes.
of those interviews.
That's right, yes.
Are at the Library of Congress,
Yeah.
and we've digitized the recordings
Yes,
now,
that's right.
so we can listen to them on our computer.
Yes.
And I was listening to them, and I
Yes.
heard you start to interview her,
Yes.
and I was just so moved because you made the recording in 1952.
Yes,
She
that's
was
right.
82 years old.
Yes,
I
that's
think.
right, yes.
So I was listening to her
Yes.
talk about her girlhood
Yes, I know,
from the
right,
19th
yes.
century. It's such a valuable
I know.
resource.
Well, I want to suggest it to Peggy Bolger and also to you and the whole staff there, that I hope that we can do at least 1 CD of those tapes, and also maybe combine them with the Eckert tapes of witchcraft from Adams County. And they would make a good collection with a brilliant introduction by me. You know, what do you call those accompanying?
Right, liner notes.
The liner notes, yes.
Yes.
Right.
Okay, that would be
Yes.
fantastic. I also wanted to ask you about your collection of religious prints and
Yes.
tour. If you could
Yes,
talk about
okay.
that.
Well, I've been interested, of course, in folk art. This is one of the aspects of Folklife studies that I have been interested in, and I've especially been interested in the difference between Catholic and Protestant folk art, the two major forms of folk art in Western Europe and, of course, in America. And I've partly got it from Richard Weiss, but I developed it further, that Protestant art is an art of the word because of the Holy Bible and the holy words of the hymns and the prayers, and it's mostly textual. And Catholic art is pictorial. The Catholics like to see pictures of God's actions in the human theater and so forth. So I've collected both of these things. Fraktur, Pennsylvania Dutch Fraktur, is centered on the text. There is decoration, of course. We like pictures too, but I think the Catholics get the prize for having more pictorial folk art and popular art. And I've collected that. I have a huge collection, which I'm hoping Cabrini College will purchase in honor of Leonard Primiano's work. He's my major successor in looking at Catholic folk art, and he gave a marvelous paper on the holy cards, the Catholic holy cards, which are commemorative cards of when a priest is ordained. There's a picture of him and a prayer on the back, or there are pictures of saints with prayers and that sort of thing. And he has an immense collection of those. But I've gathered also Pennsylvania Dutch Protestant folk art, and I've been doing this for many, many years. And of course the broadsides, including some of the prints, are now all at the Library Company of Philadelphia. It's called the Roughwood Collection, from the house that William Weaver and I own together. Mm-hmm. Yes.
And did you have religious images in your own home when you were growing up?
No, we didn't.
Okay.
No, I'm interested in, the Europeans have done much more on household pictures. Well, Jerry Pocius has done several wonderful things on the household art of religious art of Newfoundland, Protestant and Catholic. But Europeans have done more, I think. Dr. Bruckner and Krista Piska of Lübeck, whom I invited to my conference in September but couldn't come. She couldn't come because of health problems. She's done articles and I think books on what they call in Europe sofa and bedroom prints. And some of them are religious, some are not. I remember a lot of these from my boyhood in visiting houses of our neighbors. There was one of an Indian on a horse, kind of, he wasn't supposed to be crying, but it's the end of the line or something. And there were others, I can't think of them all right now, but they were very common prints that you saw in many houses. And of course there were some religious ones, like the boy Christ in the temple. I've seen that several times in my boyhood. But we, as far as I know, we didn't. I don't remember that we had any prints of that sort. My grandfather, a chronister, my mother's father, was a farmer, but he had many businesses. And one time he sold buffalo robes in the first years in the 1880s, which were wonderful at the time when you were riding in a sleigh to cover yourself up with a buffalo robe. But he also made salve. There were several farmers and who became businessmen in that area in Center County, Pennsylvania, where my mother's people all came from, and they manufactured salve. My grandfather had the Chronister Chemical Company, which manufactured Coluro salve. I still have some boxes of it, and they're 100 years old, and it's a wonderful healing salve. And when you bought a can of his Coluro salve, he gave you a print, and I have a stack of those prints. One of them is a favorite of mine. It's Rosa Bonheur's The Horse Fair, with great heavy horses that she painted, and there are many others. One of them is of balloon ascensions of farmers in the field watching a balloon go up, and these were popular prints, not folk prints, and they were nice to have. You could frame them. The salesman would give you what you wanted, and I kept a selection of them from my. I used to have a whole about a stack a foot high, but I kept the best ones that I wanted.
How do you spell that? Kulu.
C-O-L-U-R-O-. It's a wonderful salve.
Did they have other products, other medicines?
No,
Just this
that
one?
was the only one.
Okay.
Yeah.
And when you were collecting these prints, where did you find them? What was them?
Everywhere. I went to flea markets. We found some marvelous things at flea markets and antique malls. Will Weaver and I began to collect together, and we had dealers who knew that we were interested in these religious prints, and they would bring us a stack, and we'd price them and so forth, and buy them, that sort of thing. And then, of course, in Europe, I went to flea markets, and I went to Lisbon one time, wonderful city, and went to the big flea market there, and came back with a stack of 18th century saints prints, which are in the collection at present, that I hope will go to Cabrini. It's not settled yet, but I hope that it will. And these are marvelous prints. Some of them are of the universal Catholic saints, and others are of local saints. Some of them Leonard hadn't even heard of.
There's a quotation at the conclusion of your 1963 article in Pennsylvania Folklife on the Folklife Studies movement, which is, one of your seminal articles.
Yeah, right. My manifesto, as Henry Glassy always called it.
Right.
My Folklife manifesto.
That's of the articles of all of yours that we keep in the files at the American Folklife Center. That's the one that's there.
Okay,
And you
good.
said perhaps a flail can teach us more about man than a Civil War sword. Could you explain what you meant by that?
Yes, well, I was thinking of the way culture is displayed in museums, and America has glorified our military background. The Civil War period, of course, is fantastic for a lot of people. There are all sorts of Civil War buffs, including some professors that I know who go down to Virginia and dress in Union uniforms to have a mock battle with the Confederates, the Johnny Rebs, and so forth. They're fighting the Civil War again. And our museums, originally, like the county historical museums, were not geared to folk culture at all. They were geared to, or settlement patterns, they were geared to American history. They had a room for the Revolution. They had a room for the Civil War with a lot of swords and gory pictures and that sort of thing, and the First World War and that sort of thing. And I suggested in that article that we need to revise our idea of museums to stress the people in the counties and in the states, and their place in the culture from the very settlement period. How did they live in the pioneer period, and what were their homes like? What did they eat? The anthropological and folklife approach. And a flail, of course, is a primitive way of thrashing, as we would say, in central Pennsylvania. It's two sticks connected with a leather thong, and you beat the sheaves of grain which are on the ground, and there are usually 3 people to flail, and it's a 3/4 time. There's a rhythm to it. Sometimes there are 4, but mostly it's 3, and they keep time in that way. And finally, the grains are separated from the hulls, and they can take the straw away and collect the grain. It's a very primitive way of threshing, and I suggested that we can learn more from a flail. A flail can teach us more about life than a Civil War sword. I'm prejudiced, of course, because I'm not a military person, and I think we've overemphasized the military aspects of American history. And let's look at the people's aspects, the people's lives, folk life. That was what I meant, approximately. There's more to it than that, but that will do for now.
Okay, thank you. If you are comfortable about answering this, how did your religious experiences as a friend influence your life as a scholar?
Well, my mother's people were Quakers who became Methodists, as many Quakers did in the 19th century. Quakerism began to fail. There was a big division in 1827-28, very bitter division between the liberals or Hicksites, who were more the old-fashioned Quakers who believed in the inward light, and the Orthodox Quakers who were influenced, rich Philadelphia merchants who had contacts in England, and they were influenced by the English evangelical movement of the early 1800s, which emphasized the Christ on the cross, the forensic Christ, and not the Christ within, and so forth, or the inward light, as liberals call it. Because of this, the two branches of the Quakers didn't speak to each other formally. They didn't send epistles to each other as yearly meetings normally do. And it took till 1955, the two yearly meetings in Philadelphia finally came together. They could have come together much earlier, because the young friends, even in the 1890s, began to associate with the other group. And they began to say, why aren't we one group as we were before 1828? But now they're together and so forth. And I like Quaker ideas. Simplicity is something that has always been important in my families. The Quakers used the word plainness, and the Quakers had what were called the three testimonies. One was peace, and that, of course, is peace, not just military peace, but peace in the heart, and peace in the family, and peace in the local community. It's a broadened idea. The Amish have much the same idea. And then the second testimony is equality, and Quakers believed that everyone was equal. Men and women were equal, and they were the first group in Christianity to allow women to preach in public, to get around St. Paul's proscription against women preaching in public and so forth. That's very important, and I believe in that, and I think women have a ministry to give to the world, and I hope eventually that there will be women priests in the Catholic Church, but I don't know how you feel about that. Anyway, we won't go into that.
I'm interviewing you.
What?
You're the one with the answers today.
Anyway, the third of the Quaker testimonies is simplicity or plainness, and they overemphasized that perhaps sometimes. There were some Quaker preachers who, when they were entertained at a farmhouse and the dinner was brought out on floured plates, they said, take the plates away. That's very rude to do a thing like that. But there were a few ministers who were so set on their plainness that they actually did rude things like that. But in general, the Quakers believed that life should be plain, and furnishing should be plain, and speech should be plain, and that sort of thing. And I think that's good. So Quaker ideas have influenced me, and I have been interested in the fact I learned from Quakerism, as from other study of other religions, even Catholicism, that religions have a way of spinning out a culture from their ideas and ideals. There is a Quaker culture. There are Catholic cultures in Europe which are somewhat different from each other. Tyrolean Catholicism, Bavarian Catholicism, Irish Catholicism, Calabrian Catholicism in Italy, and that sort of thing. They have different saints, they have slightly different viewpoints, even though they're part of the overarching Catholic hierarchy and church. So I began to be interested in Quaker culture, and there's a Quaker vocabulary that I can record, and there are a few Quaker foods. There was no Quaker cookery as far as I could ever determine. I wrote a paper that has never been published. I hope it will be sometime. It's called Plain Cooks and Friendly Tables, a study of Quaker foods and foodways. It was a good title. And but I found that Quakers really just had American foods, mostly of British background, but they did borrow Pennsylvania German foods in the areas where the two groups settled together. They even made sauerkraut, although they called it pickled cabbage in some of the diaries. They didn't use the word sauerkraut. So Quakerism has influenced me in my own life and in my research, I think, too, I would say.
I was curious about you. The first thing you really studied, I guess, was folk religion.
Mm-hmm.
And what was your PhD at University of Chicago?
Well, it was in what we call American church history. I did mention that.
Yeah, but the
We don't
dissertation.
It was on the ecumenical movement, on the Reformed Church's interest in church union. And the Reformed Church is one of my Pennsylvania German background churches, very important to me because it began in Switzerland and it was a simpler version of Protestantism, different from Lutheranism, which was very liturgical and closer to Catholicism. And I've always valued my Reformed heritage, although I have some Lutheran heritage as well. And I studied American church history, as I said, which we don't use that term academically anymore. There's more to American religion than there is than churches, and we call it religion in America. But the dissertation was in the Reformed Church in America was always very cordial to other denominations, and in the colonial period they began building a single church for their Lutheran congregation and the Reformed congregation. They were called Gemeinschaftliche Kirchen, or union churches, and there were about 800 or 1,000 of them in eastern Pennsylvania and central Pennsylvania. It spread to Virginia and Maryland and Ohio and Indiana, the custom. Now they're breaking them up. And so the Reformed Church always has been cordial to other Protestant groups. It's not we have the only truth type of a denomination, and there are some of those, as you know. They also had a very interesting idea of organic union to merge with another church and form a new organism. And that's what they did when they joined with the Evangelical Synod of the West, which was a German church centered in St. Louis. And in 1934, the Reformed Church of the United States, the Pennsylvania German Reformed Church, joined with this 19th century church centered in St. Louis and formed the Evangelical and Reformed Church. And then in the 1950s, the ENR Church gave up its name and joined with the Congregational Christian Churches, the descendants of the Puritans in New England, and formed the United Church of Christ. I'm really sorry they gave up the ancient and very wonderful word Reformed at that time, which they should have kept. And some of the churches, the individual churches today, are putting the word Reformed back on their labels outside the churches, like Reformed Church, United Church of Christ in parentheses. But I was once very ecumenical and once very much interested. It's a good dissertation, although it's never been published. And today, as I said last night in my address, I like Hawking's idea that we need the grit of the particular, and I don't believe in church union too much anymore. I think we need all these different traditions, and I don't really like the idea of their melding down into something, into a common denominator. I've changed my ideas on ecumenicity, but while I was ecumenical, I worked with the World Council of Churches in the 1950s and wrote a very important essay on church union in the United States, which was published in the History of the Ecumenical Movement, which was published by the World Council of Churches centered in Geneva, and that has been translated into German and other languages, even Japanese. So my only article is now in Japanese, an ecumenical article. Anyway, was that,
Yeah.
does that...
Well, what I wanted to build on from that, it seems that your initial work was in what you would, I guess, call official religion.
That's right, yes.
Theology.
Yes, yeah, of course.
And
not theology, but official.
Official religion.
Yes, yes.
And what made you decide, or when did you decide, and why at one point, that what we could call folk religion or unofficial religion was was as important. It seems that it was a kind of revolutionary move.
It was,
and,
yes,
and,
it
and
was.
in many ways,
Yes.
I would think that
Yeah.
the power structure of
Yeah.
the kind of background you have thought, why is he wasting his time studying this kind of marginal?
Well, I never had any opposition from any of my colleagues or mentors in studying folk religion, but in studying official religion, the denominations, and so forth. David Hufford once gave a list of things that he thought that I stressed in class, or laid emphasis upon in my classes, that he thought were important. And one of them was that I taught my students the importance of religion and culture. And I think that's true. This is one of the things that I've always laid stress upon. And folklorists of the older version never knew what to do with religion. They divided everything into genres. They didn't have a genre called religion. They had one with the hideous name superstition at one time. And this is a term which is absolutely unacceptable in a scholarly context. I don't think we should use it. I quote statements where superstition is used, but I don't use it myself. And so the importance of religion in culture, I came to see that in folk culture, as I became interested in folk life studies, there was a folk life aspect in religion, as I tried to say earlier also. And through this two-pronged approach, the American anthropologist's approach in looking at folk Catholicism in Central America and Mexico, the Redfield approach, and the European approach of looking at people's religion in the denominations, and the need for ministers to be trained to understand that the people in the pews have a different understanding of their theology and liturgy than the trained ministers. And I put this all together in my essays on religion, which came out in Western Folklore, and I also published my essay toward a definition of folk religion in my book, Discovering American Folklife.
Okay. I'd like, if you could, to say a bit more about growing up as a child. You mentioned the farm background.
Mm-hmm.
To just say a little bit, did you grow up on a farm, and where?
My father, when my grandmother Yoder died in 1924, my father bought this wonderful farm in the Higgins Valley or Likens Valley of Schuylkill County, with a big brick house with about 15 rooms and a big walnut staircase and a huge barn and all sorts of outbuildings and orchards and fields. And he owned it for about 10 years when I was a boy. We didn't live there, but we went there very often. We were there a lot of the summers, and I became familiar with farming through that experience. And then I visited my mother's relatives on farms, and I even helped them in the hay fields and occasionally that sort of thing. So I learned some of the farm work, and I will never regret that, and I will always be happy that I had that experience. It wasn't the full experience of growing up on a farm that my father and mother had before they went away to school and got married, but it was very important for me. And to understand, in America was 95% farm people by 1800, and that has gone down, of course, considerably by now, but we still have farmers, and of course it's very machine farming and factory farming, which I object to, growing pigs in cages. They never see the earth. That's a horrible idea. And even some of the Mennonites in Lancaster County are doing that with chickens. I can't believe it, but they should have better sense than that, because they do have somewhat of an ecological orientation.
So you actually grew up in a town?
Yes, my father was the head of the apprentice schools for the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. Very important job. He had 11 schools in 5 states. Wherever the Pennsylvania Railroad company had shops. They had apprentice schools. I'm writing a little history of those schools right now for Railroad History magazine. Nobody has ever reported on this. And when he graduated from Penn State in 1910, he was hired by the Pennsylvania Railroad Company to develop this system. And Altoona was the big hub of the PRR, and we lived there, but owned the farm and went there very often.
So I'd like to ask you about your school growing up, the schools you attended.
Yeah, well, I went to a wonderful grade school in Altoona. We called them grade schools. A brick building. It was 3 blocks from my house. And the first week, I loved it so much that I started up there. We came back for lunch, always, and had an afternoon session. And in the first week, my parents told me this later, that I started up to school after supper. I thought there was a session after supper. I loved it so much. I mean, I've been a student all my life. I'm still a student in a sense. And I loved almost every moment of the grade school, the 8 years. And then I went to the Roosevelt Junior High School in Altoona, named for Theodore Roosevelt, not for FDR. And then I went to the senior high school. And I took Latin. I took 6 years of Latin. I loved Latin. I even loved it so much that I thought I might want to teach it in college, but I'm glad I never did, because there are various jobs in Latin classics are very hard to get at the present time. But then I went to Franklin and Marshall College. My father had gone to Penn State, and my sister went to Penn State, and various cousins went to Penn State. So I was tempted to go there, but instead, because I had 2 uncles who had gone to the Pennsylvania German college called Franklin and Marshall, which was founded as Franklin College in Lancaster in 1787, for the Pennsylvania German people, to help them to fit into American society more, I suppose. I went there. I had an uncle who became a Reformed minister, Franklin Faust, and he was a member of the class of 1898. And my father's brother, William F. Yoder, was a member of the class of 1908. And my uncle, Will Yoder, told me about the old professors there. He had a professor named Joseph Henry Dupps, the UBPS, who was a leading Reformed minister and professor, and he was one of the first writers about the Pennsylvania Dutch culture, or Pennsylvania German culture, in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So then I went I finished that in 3 years because it was during the war, and then I went to the University of Chicago and got my doctorate in 1947, and was called to Union Theological Seminary by one of my major professors who was moving there.
I wanted to ask, I have some kind of classic formulaic folklore interview questions. What would you think was your most either amusing or challenging fieldwork experience over the years? If you had to think of...
Well, that would take some thought. I really don't know whether I could answer that right now.
Okay, we can do that.
Yeah, right.
Thinking back in terms of your career at Penn and the folklore program there, what do you think are some of the most important courses that you introduced?
Well, I did, of course, in 1957 began the first course. It may have been the first in the United States, this would have to be checked, on American folk religion, and I taught that about every 2 years. Since then, I taught a big course. I had 28 people in it in 1995, the next to last year that I taught. And in 1967, I began my course in Folklife Studies, which was my favorite course too, and I taught that every other year, and got the best of the students into that, and that was the first one, at least called Folklife Studies, in the United States. They didn't have that in Indiana at the time, or UCLA, and I had a stellar group there. 3 of the people were Henry Glassy, Archie Green, and let's see, there was a third one, very important, Jay Anderson. And they were all stellar students, and Henry Glassey's reputation is international, and Archie Green is now 90 or 95. He's living in California, and one of the great scholars of popular music and religious popular music, that sort of thing, and other things, a delightful person. And Jay Anderson directed museums. The Colonial Pennsylvania Plantation was under his direction for a while, and he went to Iowa and directed a living historical farm, or that may be his term, I don't know, for one of the Iowa universities, and then he moved to Logan, Utah, to Utah State, and directed some historical farms, and wrote books on museum work and that sort of thing. And he did his dissertation under me. It was on food, and it was called Foodways of Stuart, England. And he was planning a multi-volume work on the history of New England foods. And this was the first blast looking at the background in England. But he never finished the others. But they were three brilliant students, and I learned as much from them as they probably learned from me. And I had other brilliant students along the way, including Jerry Pocius and Bernard Herrmann and so forth. Students whose works I have admired and watched their careers growing as one of the great joys of a teacher, as you know, Jerry.
That's right. One of the things that students always talk about that have studied with you are your famous field trips. And I just wanted to ask you about those and why you started them and why they were important.
Yeah, well, there are many ways in which you can present materials, and I did liven up my courses in folk religion and folklife studies by using recordings occasionally. I use slides, of course, and one way, there's no substitute for being in an area, looking at a building out in where it belongs in the ecology, and seeing landscapes, rural landscapes and city landscapes, vernacular landscapes. And so we had tours. I took some of my classes to Germantown, to the Germantown Historical Society, and we visited the Worcester House, Grumblethorpe, and so forth. At Germantown Avenue should be an open-air museum. And I took people up to Lancaster County to visit Old Order Mennonite meeting houses, and we went to the Ephrata Cloister and Landis Valley Museum. I took them up to Berks County to the Ole area, and we always visited churches, and I talked about the importance of religion and folk culture. And one time we always took our lunch along, usually, and one time we ate in a cemetery. It was quite a nice experience. I recommend it on a sunny day. But the students have always complimented my fabulous field trips, and I'm glad I did begin them. I had several a semester usually for some of the courses.
One more question. What do you think is your most important contribution of your career?
Well, I think spreading the term folklife into the academic world. Dr. Shoemaker really brought it to America. There may have been a few people who knew about it, but they didn't use it in their work. It was mentioned in the 1946 folklore conference at Indiana University that Stith Thompson and others had organized before Dick Dorson became head of that program. It was mentioned once by a Swedish scholar. He mentioned the term folklife in connection with Swedish research. It had nothing to do with America. It was used once in 1873, the term folklife, in a magazine article like in Harper's or Atlantic Monthly on European or German folk life. They used that word, but that had no influence on the academic world. But Dr. Shoemaker's bringing the term to America from Ireland and from Sweden especially, and my work after 1950 familiarizing myself with the use of the concept by various scholars that Dr. Shoemaker had never met and universities that he had never visited. I think I'm the principal person in introducing the term into the academic world through my writings.
And it's the pervasive term today.
Yes, it is. I know, and I'm very happy that it's used at the Library of Congress with the American Folklife Center, and it's used in the Smithsonian Institution. It's used in connection with many public sector institutes in the states. Some are state folklorists, but others use the term folklife, like the Vermont Folklife Commission and so forth. There are many states that are using that term, and I think it's important. I'm very proud of that I was able to help to spread that important term and concept of looking at our own cultures. Good.
Okay, that's what I have.
Well, thank you, Jerry.
My name is Bill Westerman, and I'm at Princeton University this year, and just would like to start by saying it's a tremendous honor for me to be interviewing my dissertation advisor, Don Yoder. I'd like to start by asking you a question about something you said during the break when he was changing the tape.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that you had a railroad pass when you were a child, and
I did.
you used that to travel?
I certainly did. Yeah, I went all over the system, as they called it, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and I had that through my college days.
And were you doing it for recreational purposes, or were you doing field work on your own at that point?
I was visiting relatives and visiting libraries, and so I came to Philadelphia and became familiar with the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, one of the great collections of Americana in the world, and so forth. And I actually I went to Penn while I was in the University of Chicago, and I wanted to in the 40s, 60 years ago, and I met Otto Springer, who became dean of the college and graduate school later on, but he was head of the German department, brilliant man, a German, and I had heard that Penn had two pamphlets published in 1928 by Adolf Gerber on Württemberg emigration to America in the 18th century. And Dr. Springer allowed me to borrow those, and I translated them and published them in 1945 in the Pennsylvania German Folklore Yearbook. And that was one of my first major projects in immigration history, which is something that interests me very much. And I'm also interested in the genealogical knowledge that we can get from these ship lists and other things. Dr. Gerber was an interesting person. We should have a biography of him sometime. He was at Earlham College, the Quaker college, in Indiana for a while, and he wrote several things that appeared in German-American periodicals, but then he must have gone back to Germany, and he did these two. He went to church records, and he went to the civil records of applications for immigration and went through them and copied the material and published them in a very interesting way. And this was my first major article in 1945. That's 61 years ago.
And at what point did you realize, obviously you grew up in a community, there were thousands of people who had very similar upbringings to yours. At what point did you realize that you were going to take the distinct path of a scholar and actually study your own people?
Well, I became interested in my own background through the difference between my father's culture and my mother's culture. I wrote about this in Discovering American Folklife, and I think it's important enough for me to mention it here. My mother's background was in Center County, Pennsylvania, farm background. Her father had been in local politics. He was sheriff of the county 1896 to 1900, but then he was a farmer the rest of his life until he moved to the city. And my mother had no folk songs. She knew all the hymns of the church and the gospel songs. She knew all the First World War songs since she was an unmarried young girl at the time when the First World War was dominating American thought. And there was one horrible song that she knew called "Give Me a Lucifer to Light My Fag," to light my cigarette, I guess that meant, I hope. And I said in my writing that this always seemed incongruous to me in an area which disapproved of cigarette smoking. And then there was the long, long way to Tipperary, that Irish war song. She knew those songs because they were the popular songs of the day. She knew no folk songs. When I went to my grandmother's farm that my father bought in 1924 and visited these wonderful aunts who spoke Pennsylvania Dutch, they had folk songs. And I became interested in this, and I became interested in my Pennsylvania Dutch linguistic heritage, and I finally pried a lot of it out of my father so that I could learn to read it and write it and speak it, and not perfectly, but I still do speak it. And I began to record in the 1940s from these aunts with the wonderful memories for songs and proverbs and everything else. And all of this influenced me terrifically. So the difference between my father's culture and my mother's culture, mother was partly of Pennsylvania Dutch background and partly of Quaker background. She did cook some Pennsylvania Dutch foods, but her culture was more Americanized than my father's culture. And I used in writing about this and discovering American Folklife, in the introduction where I went into my intellectual background, I said I feel this was very similar to the situation in the autobiography of Theodor Heuss, the Chancellor of Germany, who said that he began to understand himself when he realized the difference between his Swabian father and from Württemberg and his Rhineland mother. They had different personalities, different cultures.
Was it, then it was around that time that you also became exposed to Fraktur?
Yes, I became interested by my dear Aunt Emma, who was such an influence on my career. She sang 49 of the songs that I included in Pennsylvania Spirituals out of 150. I recorded many more from her, but I included 49 of hers in that book. She was terrifically important for me in shaping me toward interest in Pennsylvania German culture. But what was your question again?
When you became exposed to Fraktur?
Oh yes, she, one memorable day in my late boyhood, she went to her bureau drawer and brought out a roll of Fraktur and gave it to me. And this was the Yoder and Hepler Fraktur from her father and mother's family, my family's, back to 1780. And they were rolled up in the bureau drawer, and these are in my personal, my prize collection at the present time.
Did you ever learn to sing any of the spirituals yourself?
I don't sing. I never have sung. It's rather strange. I never have sung a hymn in church. I know all the hymns. I played them on the piano. I played for Sunday school and prayer meeting, and once or twice I had the horrible experience of playing the organ in church. And you had to be aware of what was going on in the liturgy, and I didn't like that, but I went through it without too much trouble. But I love the hymns. I don't agree with the theology, much of it anymore, but I love the hymns, and I play them sometimes if I have a piano nearby, and I love the tunes. Some of them are American popular tunes, and others are the German chorale tunes of the bitter 17th century and so forth. I love hymns, and I've done a lot of work on hymns.
What about recitation? Was there any recitation of Pennsylvania German poetry that was in your family? Or?
Yes, my Aunt Emma was she would recite poetry. She loved Dutch poetry, and she would be called upon at community gatherings, women's groups, and Sunday school picnics to perform. Right.
I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm wondering, is there any poetry that you can recite at this point?
I could, but I would rather not, if you don't mind. Yes, right.
So was it when you were studying under Dr. Shoemaker that you realized that that was what you wanted to do?
I never studied under him. We were colleagues,
Okay.
equal colleagues at Franklin and Marshall College. I never studied with him. But we influenced each other. We worked for 16 to 15 years together. On the festival, we would always go up a week ahead to Kutztown and I put up exhibits and interviewed people. I have a lot of recordings that we made at the Kutztown Festival, extremely valuable recordings.
So at what point did you realize that this was what you wanted to devote your life to?
Well, it was before that. It was when I was in college. I went to Franklin and Marshall, and they had a wonderful library there with Pennsylvania German materials, and I spent most of my evenings in the library. And I met Elizabeth Clark Kiefer, who was a reference librarian. Her grandfather was Joseph Henry Dopes, the Audenried Professor of History that I mentioned, who was brilliant and wrote a lot of good Pennsylvania German history. And her other grandfather was Dr. J. Spangler Kiefer, a distinguished Reformed minister. She had kind of grown up in the whole Reformed church background, and we talked. I met her the first night I was in college in 1939. I went to the New Fackenthal Library and met Elizabeth, and we became friends, and we corresponded the rest of our lives. She's no longer living, but she was delightful, and she was interested in my career and my interest in the Pennsylvania Germans, and she helped me a lot. And Herbert Onstead, the librarian of Franklin and Marshall College, also was very cordial to my work and my interests.
Do you remember, I'm going to come back to a variant of Jerry Pocius's question. Do you remember any particular moments in your fieldwork that were very reaffirming to your decision to have gone into this life?
It's hard to say. I don't think I could really answer that.
What happened to the farm, to your father's farm? You said they had it for 10 years.
We had to sell it during the Depression. It was very sad. It was the only time I ever saw my father shed a tear. It was that he lost the farm. And it was a very sad occasion. And it's still there. I can go there and see the house, but the lower part of the house has been ruined by the people who own it. They've torn out the partitions. There used to be 2 rooms on one side, a big living room, a dining room, and a huge kitchen. And then there was a summer kitchen where we always ate in the summer, with 2 rooms with a stove and a wood box in the back room, and the big dining table and the corner cupboard. And I remember when the threshermen came, they always liked to eat there because my Aunt Emma was a magnificent cook, one of the best cooks I've ever known in America. And they always liked to have the threshermen's dinner there. And I remember sitting there with all these threshermen, little boy, and listening to the Dutch, which I didn't understand at the time, and watching them gorge, and I was gorging too. It was a wonderful occasion. The summer kitchen is a beautiful idea, and it took the heat out of the main part of the house and so forth, and it was a delightful place to eat.
One of the most profound things for me about taking your Folklife Studies course, one of the really eye-opening experiences for me was that the Folklife methodology enabled me to see an aesthetic and to see beauty in genres and things that are not taught as art, such as cookery, such as religion, such as craft.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the aesthetic dimension of Folklife Studies.
Yes. Well, I'm terrifically impressed with the aesthetic dimension of folklife, of crafts and so forth, and I think that in some ways the aesthetic has been overemphasized by museums. They like to collect pretty things, and they neglected tools and things like that, which you don't put up on a wall for display. But there is the idea that there was a folk aesthetic, and I like Henry Glassey's idea of the folk filter, that a folk artist never really could spin his ideas out of his own mind. He had his traditional ideas, but he would usually look at a print or a picture, a Bible picture, and then transfer it through his mind, and it came out flat and abstract and so forth. I think that's a very brilliant idea, and I've used it in my own writings, attributing it to Henry Glassy. But you should go across the street and to the Milwaukee County Historical Society Museum or Historical Center, which is a triangular building right across the street. And the head of it is one of my Dr. Kinder, Bob Teskey. Do you know Bob?
Not yet.
Okay, you must meet him. He's having a reception there this evening, but I can't make it. And he has a very good, the place is all cluttered. They're doing a new stairway and so forth, but go to see the second floor exhibit on crafts, on folk crafts, and there's a very interesting transition from some Norwegian craftsmen in Europe and to America. And there's some very nice pieces of material that just explain the folk aesthetic with common things that people had around their houses. And I think that's very important. And there certainly was a folk aesthetic, and that's shown in fraktur, it's shown in hex signs, it's shown in decorated furniture, and everything else, and possibly in a much wider sense you're suggesting too. I liked your dissertation for bringing out some of those things, those broader ideas of folklife studies. And yours was the last one that I think directed.
So. Well, thank you for that. What about the value of and the role of local museums and local historical museums?
They're very important, but as I said before, I think they should be revised into anthropological folklife approaches from the settlement history, the Indian background. I use the word American Indian. I'm a Native American myself, I feel, and that's a buzzword that I don't use. You don't have to worry about that. And the Indian background, the geological background, the Indian background, the settlement history of the Europeans, they could have something of the war history too, because that is American history, but farming and everyday life and that sort of thing. And some very good historical society museums, county museums, are taking that approach now, revising their approach to show the way the people lived, which is so important, and not just the national government imposing itself in culture on the local scene.
What do you think that folklife studies offers that no other discipline offers?
Well, one of the things that it offers is that you look at yourself, and my synonym for folklife studies is the study of your own culture. And this is something which anthropologists are doing now, but at one time they had to head out Margaret Mead fashion to the non-Western world and live themselves into an understanding of a foreign culture, and there were all sorts of pitfalls there. The folklife approach is that you grow up in the culture, as I think I have said before, and you go away and study the methods of studying culture, anthropological, historical, linguistic, and others, aesthetic, and come back and study your own culture. And that's what the European Volkskunde people in all the German-speaking areas have done. It's what the French and Italian and Spanish folklore specialists, they use the word folklore, but they include folklife in it. And what they have done, they've looked at their own cultures. And a second thing which folklife studies offers, which anthropology at least did not originally offer, it does now somewhat, is to have a historical background, to look at the historical sources of your culture in the past, to reconstruct past levels of the culture that you were studying in the present. And this is very important, and I call this historical ethnography and use the term current ethnography for research work and interviews in the present. And folklife studies does combine those two ethnographies, and in a very important way. Some anthropologists are using historical backgrounds. They began to do that in the war, I think, and at Penn, the very important anthropologist studied industrial communities in the past, which is really a branch of folklife studies as far as I'm concerned.
And my last question is about the life of the scholar. And I'm wondering what you feel that the greatest rewards have been for you since you've chosen the life of the scholar.
Well, the greatest reward of the teacher is his students. And as I said in my Discovering American Folklife, which is still one of my favorite books, I said students are there to go further than their teachers. So go, students, go. I said that of the essay. And I believe that, and I've learned as much from my students as they have, I think, learned from me. And I've learned from you, and I've learned from Maggie and Jerry and everyone that I've taught, because there's a personal relation in teaching. It's very priceless, absolutely priceless.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the interview, and thank you for
Well, thank
all the
you.
guidance along the way.
Thank you all for this
You-
splendid,
you wanna-
these questions.
I had one more question
Mhm.
on my list. There's really, I think Bill touched on this
Mhm.
just a moment ago, and also I wanted to thank Leonard Primiano, who would
Yes,
have
yes.
loved to have been here.
Oh, yes,
We would have all
indeed,
loved to have
yes.
had him. And,
I would
we're-
thank him
we're-
too for this.
Yeah, so we're
Yes.
thinking about him
Yes.
into the
Mhm.
future for the next time. But I wanted to ask what directions you see for the future development of folklife studies in the U.S.
Well, I've watched the broadening of folklife studies from concentration on peasant culture, with which it began in the 19th century, to urban culture, to working class culture, to various other forms, to group culture of various sorts, as long as there's a community and tradition and Rickard Weiss's definition, and so forth. And in my statement for the presidency in 1979 for this institution, which I read last night, and a lot of people told me they were glad that I did. I can give you a copy of it if you want it. I said that we should be doing more with ethnic studies. I think folklorists are doing much with ethnic studies now, but there was a time when folklore programs didn't deal too much with the ethnic groups in their background. Now they're doing it. Linda Dake and Richard Dorson were pioneers in that, looking at the ethnic groups in northern Indiana and so forth. Certainly this program today, this 100-page program, has a lot of ethnic studies in it. I'm very, very impressed with it.
Yes, I think it has a lot of
Yes.
religious folklife in it,
Yes,
too,
that's
which
right,
is
and
one
I'm
of the
pleased.
things that's...
That's one of the things that I have always stressed and hope that it will continue. And again, the historical, I think we need the historical approach too.
Right.
And I was surprised when I was a member of the Board of Trustees of the American Folklife Center in 1976, 78, or whenever it was. I made several suggestions at different times that the new institution should have an historical branch to record materials, to abstract and record materials from travel books, cookbooks, diaries, newspapers, and so forth, the way they're doing in Sweden at Nordiska Museet and at every folk cultural institute in Europe that I have visited. They have this great historical interest, and this was vetoed by the Librarian of Congress, who felt that they should only look at the current situation. And I object to that. I think it's much too narrow. I mean, I'm glad that the Folklife Center has done so much with some state folklore and so forth, current, and they've recorded a lot of wonderful things. But I think they still need an historical dimension. And I'll say that again, I'll say it again and again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yoder.
Thank you, Maggie.
We are just honored that you're here. and
Well,
we
I'm
feel
honored to
very-
be here,
Thank you
certainly.
so much.
Thank you.